What if the one thing that could have saved your entire life was a letter you never sent? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In today's live story, we bring you a tale of regret, divine redirection, and a decades-long journey of redemption. This story begins in the heat of 1977 Chicago. But the fire that burned would echo for generations. She thought her chance had passed forever, but fate, and something far greater, had other plans. Her name was Marlene. In the summer of 1977, Marlene Benson sat on the edge of her twin bed, her knees pressed together, her palms sweaty, and a letter trembling in her hands. She was 19, living in a worn-down two-story on the south side of Chicago, where dreams often died before they had the chance to fly. The air in her room buzzed with the sound of a box fan in the window. The sun bled orange through the blinds, and on her lap was a letter she'd rewritten 3 times. It was addressed to someone she wasn't supposed to write, Eddie Darnell. She hadn't seen him in 4 months, not since the night he left for boot camp, the night she found out she was pregnant. Eddie had begged her to wait, but he didn't know what her father had done after he found out. "You will not shame this family," her father had thundered, pacing the hallway with his belt in hand. The baby was gone before she even had a bump. Her mother sobbed in the kitchen while her father made the arrangements. There were no questions, no hugs, no prayers, only silence and punishment. Eddie never knew. And now, he never would. Unless she sent this letter. But her fingers froze. What would she say? "Dear Eddie, I lied. I didn't lose the baby. I gave her up because I wasn't allowed to keep her. I've thought about her every day since." Number that wasn't enough, and it was too much. So she folded the letter again, slipped it in the top drawer under a pair of knee-high socks. And just like that, Marlene Benson sealed away a piece of her soul. Life moved on. Marlene studied nursing at Malcolm X College. She graduated, moved to Peoria. She married a kind, quiet man named Victor Evans. No children came. They didn't talk about it. She never told him about the letter, or the child, or Eddie. God had turned the page, she thought. This was a new chapter. But at night she still dreamt of a baby with curly hair and a young man in army greens, reading a letter that never arrived. She thought the past was buried. But in 2010, while cleaning out her mother's old house after the funeral, Marlene found the letter again, still sealed, still trembling. The house on 84th and Halsted hadn't changed much since Marlene last saw it in 1993. The porch still creaked under her weight. The smell of mildew and pine sol mixed in the air, and the living room clock still ticked, like it was counting down something you didn't want to face. Her mother had passed quietly in her sleep. The cancer took her slower than her secrets did. Marlene had cried, but only a little. The grief was heavy, but strange, like mourning a woman she'd never truly known. Now, sorting through the bedroom drawers, Marlene found the old socks first. Yellowed, stretched out. Then the envelope, still sealed. Her breath caught in her throat. The postmark was never stamped. The corners were curled. Her teenage handwriting screamed from the front. Eddie Darnell, U.S. Army Training Center, Fort Jackson, South Carolina. She hadn't even included a return address. Marlene sat on the edge of the same twin bed where she once wrote it. The same bed where her childhood collapsed into adulthood. She ran her fingers over the paper. It felt like touching a ghost. She didn't open it. She couldn't. She didn't need to. She remembered every word. Later that night at the kitchen table, she made tea and stared at the letter under the dim yellow light. Victor was at home in Peoria, thinking she was staying at a hotel. She hadn't told him she was sleeping in her old room again. The house had no heat. The wind howled outside, but something inside her was colder than the December air. She reached for her phone. For years, she never tried looking Eddie up. She assumed he moved on, married, maybe he was gone. But tonight, something pressed on her chest like a divine finger. Look. Now she typed his name into Google. Nothing. Then, Edward Darnell, Chicago veteran. A hit. A link to a 1995 Tribune article. Veteran opens South Side outreach for at-risk youth. Her hand trembled as she clicked. There he was. Older, but unmistakably Eddie. Same eyes, same thick brows, a little grayer around the temples. Smiling next to a sign that read, "The Bridge Project. Director Edward Darnell." Marlene covered her mouth. He was still here, still helping people, still building bridges. She felt the tears slide down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. She should have told him. She should have let him be a father. She should have sent the letter. But here's what Marlene didn't know, what she couldn't have known. Just 2 weeks earlier, a young woman named Danielle Harper, age 33, had walked into that same outreach center. She came in looking for help with a job application. And she walked out with more questions about herself than she'd walked in with. Because Eddie Darnell had seen something familiar in Danielle's eyes, something he couldn't explain. And Danielle? She'd never known her birth parents, only that she was adopted in Chicago in 1978. Coincidence or something more? Danielle Harper had always known she was adopted. Her parents, Tom and Rose Harper, were kind people from Rockford, Illinois. They'd told her the truth when she was 9, sitting on the back porch while fireflies blinked around them like tiny angels. "Your birth mother loved you," Rose had said, gently brushing Danielle's curls behind her ear. "She just couldn't keep you." Danielle believed her, at least for a while. But love that disappears without a trace leaves behind a different kind of wound. The kind that scabs over and reopens every birthday, every Mother's Day, every time someone asked, "You look nothing like your mom." She was 33 now, single, no children, a little too smart for her job at the office supply store, and a little too soft for the hard world around her. She'd come to Chicago to start over. No grand plan, just a city where no one knew her, and where she could rebuild quietly. She didn't expect a miracle. But on a cloudy Thursday afternoon in November 2010, she walked into the Bridge Project on 79th Street to get help filling out a job form. Her hands were shaking from the cold, and her boots were soaked from a slush puddle. She felt small and unsure as she stepped into the warmth of the community center. And that's when she saw him. The man who looked back at her like he'd seen her before. Edward Darnell wasn't a man prone to superstition. He believed in hard work, second chances, and the kind of grace that's earned through sweat. He'd buried friends, survived war, and lost his younger brother to the streets. He didn't chase ghosts. But the moment Danielle stepped through the door, something cracked open in him. She had her mother's eyes. He didn't know how he knew that, only that he did. "Can I help you?" he asked, standing from behind the front desk. She looked nervous. Yeah. I heard you help people with employment stuff." "Sure do," he said with a warm smile. "Come on in, I'm Eddie." She hesitated. "Danielle." "Danielle," he repeated, almost tasting the name. "Nice to meet you." He led her to a side office. She sat down, pulling out a folded paper from her bag. "It's for a city custodial position. I just don't want to mess it up." He nodded, reading over the form. But his mind wasn't on the application. It was on the way her hand trembled, just like Marlene's used to. On the way, she tilted her head when she listened. On the sadness tucked in the corners of her mouth. He asked gently, "You from Chicago?" "Kind of, born here. Adopted out to Rockford. I just moved back." He froze. "You said adopted?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded. "Yeah, closed adoption. Bin dokuz 178. His heart pounded. He swallowed. "You ever try finding your birth parents?" She smiled faintly. "Not really. I think they didn't want to be found." He leaned back in his chair. Maybe she was just another soul searching for a path. Or maybe, just maybe, she was the page he never got to read. That night, Eddie couldn't sleep. He pulled out an old shoebox from under his bed. Inside it was a letter he'd written in 1978, addressed to a child who never knew he existed. Eddie Darnell hadn't opened that shoebox in years. It was tucked behind a stack of tax folders, some faded photographs, and a worn King James Bible with pages yellowing at the edges. He kept the box not out of hope, but out of duty. Inside were 3 things. 1, a silver charm bracelet with a tiny heart on it. 2, a folded photo of a teenage Marlene. taken in 1976 by the Lake Michigan shoreline. 3 and a letter. It was never sent. He had written it the night he came home from Fort Jackson in 1978. The week he found out, through whispers and family gossip, that Marlene had vanished from school, that she'd left Chicago for a nursing college, and that she'd lost the baby, a phrase so casually dropped at a family cookout that it hit him like shrapnel. He didn't know if it meant miscarriage or abortion or something else. All he knew was that the baby he imagined holding, naming, teaching, raising, was gone. And so he wrote a letter. To my daughter, wherever you are, I don't know your name. I don't even know if you made it into this world. But if you did, I want you to know something. I loved you before I knew you. I prayed for you every night in South Carolina. I imagined your little feet, your laugh. I imagined watching you sleep. If God let you live, I hope He gave you a mother strong enough to raise you with love. And if one day, by some miracle, you ever read this, please know, I never stopped looking. Eddie folded the letter back into the box, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed his knuckles into his eyes. Danielle, could it be? He'd seen hundreds of young women come through his doors, some broken, some angry, some lost. But this one felt different, and he couldn't shake the feeling, the way she looked at him, the pull he felt when she spoke, like something old inside him whispering, "You're not done yet." The next day, Danielle came back. He saw her from the window and met her at the door. "You back for that job form?" he asked with a smile. She laughed softly. "Nah, I got it done. Just wanted to say thanks." They sat on the front bench, sipping coffee in paper cups, watching kids toss a football on the cracked pavement. "Can I ask something personal?" Eddie said. Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Sure. You ever feel like someone out there is praying for you?" She stared at him, caught off guard. "Why do you ask that?" He shrugged, but his voice was low and honest. "Because sometimes I think my prayers took too long to arrive, but maybe they still found you." Danielle looked away. Her throat tightened. "No one's ever said that to me." He nodded, as if understanding something only he and God could understand. Then he asked gently, "Would you be willing to take a DNA test?" Danielle blinked. "What?" He smiled, hesitant but certain. "Because if I'm right, you've been sitting across from your father for 2 days now." Danielle laughed at first. Not a full laugh, more of a nervous chuckle like someone told her the punchline before the setup. "You think you're my father?" Eddie didn't smile. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I've never felt this way with anyone else who walked through that door. And I've been doing this a long time." She stood slowly, hugging her coat tighter around her. "This is crazy," she said. "I don't even know you." "I know," he said. "I don't want to scare you." Her eyes filled. "I spent my whole life wondering who my parents were. I imagined maybe I was abandoned. Maybe they didn't love me." Eddie's voice cracked. "You weren't. At least not by me." Danielle blinked. "So, you're telling me I wasn't unwanted?" Eddie looked down at his hands. "You were everything I wanted, but I didn't get a choice." She sat back down slowly. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but I know I've been praying for answers for years." Eddie nodded. "Maybe God's answering both our prayers, just not the way we expected." 2 weeks later, the test results came in. Marlene had just returned from her trip to Chicago. The letter was still in her bag, unopened, unread. But something in her had changed. She didn't tell Victor. She couldn't. Instead, she called Eddie. His voice cracked the second he heard hers. "Marlene?" She nearly dropped the phone. "It's me," she whispered. I found the letter." He was silent. "I never sent it," she continued. "I wanted to, I tried. But my father—" "I know," Eddie said softly. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness." "I already gave it," he said without hesitation. 30 years ago. She cried then, deep, silent sobs that came from the place where her motherhood had been buried. "I need to see you," he said. She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "And there's something else," she whispered. "What?" "I think I met our daughter." Microhook. Emotional turn. When Marlene walked into the bridge project 3 days later and saw Danielle for the first time, Her knees nearly gave out, because in Danielle's eyes, she saw her own. Danielle stood frozen. Eddie had prepared her, told her Marlene might come, that it wasn't simple, that the story was complicated and painful. But nothing prepared her for this. The woman who stepped through the door didn't look like a villain. She looked like a woman who'd carried grief alone for too long. Marlene approached slowly, tears brimming. "I wrote you a letter," she said, voice trembling, "but I never sent it." Danielle swallowed. "I wrote one too," she replied, "last year, to the mother I never met." They stared at each other, 2 generations of silence colliding in a single breath. Then Danielle opened her arms, and Marlene, shaking, stepped into them. They held each other as though time could be rewound in an embrace. Eddie stepped back, tears running down his face. He didn't say a word. He just watched as the 2 halves of his broken heart came together. They lost 33 years. But God doesn't count in years. He counts in moments. And this one? This was a miracle. Marlene stayed in Chicago for 4 more days. Each day was a quiet miracle. They sat in Eddie's modest apartment, him on the recliner, Danielle cross-legged on the floor, Marlene beside the fireplace sipping hot tea with both hands. They talked for hours, not rushing, not explaining everything, just slowly untangling the knots of time. Danielle brought photo albums. Her adoptive parents had saved every school picture, every drawing, every birthday candle blown out. Eddie listened with wide, grateful eyes, laughing at the 3rd-grade pigtails, nearly tearing up at her high school graduation photo. "She looks like you when she's mad," Eddie said once, nudging Marlene. "I do not," Danielle said, then narrowed her eyes playfully, and they all burst out laughing. It was gentle, awkward, holy. But not everything could stay inside the warm glow of a fireplace reunion. Marlene had a husband, and a life, and a truth that couldn't stay buried anymore. Victor met her at the Peoria train station with a small smile and a winter coat in hand. He was a good man. Always had been. Dependable, quiet, faithful. But even good men can carry blind spots. "How was the hotel?" he asked. Marlene hesitated. "It wasn't the hotel." He blinked. "No?" She swallowed hard. "I went back to the old house." His brow furrowed. "I found something," she said. "A letter I wrote when I was 19. His face shifted, something flickered behind his eyes. "Marlene, there's more," she continued, voice trembling. "I had a child before you and I met, a daughter. I gave her up. My parents forced it. I never told anyone." Victor said nothing. "And Eddie," she whispered, "was the father." Now he spoke. "Eddie, Darnell?" She nodded. "I found him. I found her. Her name is Danielle." Victor backed up like she'd slapped him. "You lied to me for 30 years?" Marlene's voice broke. "I lied to myself longer." That night, Victor slept in the guest room, and Marlene sat in the living room alone, staring at the framed cross above the fireplace. She had imagined this moment for decades. She had feared it, avoided it, prepared 1,000 different versions in her head. But nothing hurt more than the silence that followed. Invisible emotional turn, microhook. Victor wasn't angry because she'd loved another man. He was angry because for 30 years, he thought he knew everything about the woman he loved. And now, he realized he'd only known half of her. Danielle, meanwhile, sat in her own apartment, staring at her bathroom mirror. She wasn't sure who she was looking at. She was still Danielle Harper. But now she was also Danielle Benson Darnell? Her real mother was alive. Her father hadn't abandoned her. Her life wasn't a mistake. Then why did she feel so lost? She'd spent so long building a story about herself. A story where she was unwanted, unloved, and alone. And now, that story didn't fit anymore. She reached for her Bible. It had been dusty, untouched since her college years. She opened to a random page. Her eyes fell on a verse. "And I will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten." Joel 2:25. Her lip trembled. Maybe she wasn't alone. Maybe the God she thought had forgotten her had just been waiting. Sometimes God doesn't rewrite your story. He just brings back the pages you thought were lost forever. Victor didn't say a word for 3 days. He went to work, came home, ate quietly, slept alone. Marlene gave him space, but each silence felt like a punishment she wasn't sure she could bear. She wanted to explain, but how do you explain something that shaped your soul in silence? On the 4th day, he came home, hung his coat, and said, "Let's talk." She met him in the kitchen. He didn't sit, just leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You should have told me." "I know. I've loved you for 30 years. "I know that too." He looked at her, tears caught in his lashes. "And I would have loved her too, if you'd let me." That undid her. She reached for him, and he let her. They stood in the center of the kitchen, wrapped in a kind of sorrow only the faithful know, the sorrow of what might have been. "She wants to meet you," Marlene whispered. Victor nodded. "I want to meet her, too." Meanwhile, Danielle sat across from a therapist for the first time in her life. Her foster parents had offered it when she was younger, but she'd always said no. Now she needed answers, or maybe just a mirror. "I feel like my whole life was written in pencil," she told the counselor, "and someone came along and erased it." "Who came along?" the therapist asked. "My birth parents. And is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Danielle didn't know how to answer. "I'm angry," she admitted, "but not at them, at the world, at how things just got stolen." "Have you told them how you feel?" "No," she whispered. "I don't want to hurt them. They already hurt enough." The therapist leaned forward. "Forgiveness isn't silence. It's truth, spoken in love." Danielle nodded slowly, the words sinking in. Maybe she didn't need to pretend everything was healed. Maybe healing needed her honesty first. That weekend, Danielle invited Eddie and Marlene over for dinner. Victor came too. It was awkward at first. Victor stood stiffly in the living room, hands in pockets. Danielle handed him a plate of lasagna and a nervous smile. "You like basketball?" she asked, grasping at anything. He glanced at the game playing on her TV. "Bulls fan since '85. Danielle smiled. "Same." That was all it took. By dessert, they were arguing about who was the real GOAT, Michael or LeBron, and Marlene was laughing so hard she spilled coffee on her blouse. For the first time, it felt like family. Not perfect, but real. Micro-hook. Invisible emotional peak. Later that night, after everyone had left, Danielle stood alone in her kitchen and realized something she hadn't dared to believe in a long time. She wasn't missing anymore. She'd been found. Back at home, Marlene sat at her vanity, brushing her hair in silence. Victor appeared in the doorway. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. She met his eyes in the mirror. "No," she said, "not anymore." He walked in and kissed the top of her head. "I don't either." They sat in bed that night, fingers laced together under the quilt, and prayed for the daughter who'd returned like a prodigal they didn't deserve. Across town, Eddie wrote a new letter. This time, he sealed it in an envelope and handed it to Danielle the next day. "To read when you're ready," he said. She opened it that night. "Danielle, I've loved you for 33 years, without a name, without a photo, without a single word back. Now that I know you, I'd still love you, even if you weren't mine. But you are. And nothing can ever undo that. Love, Dad." She kept that letter on her nightstand, because some letters don't arrive too late. They arrive right on time, when your heart is finally ready to read them. Spring 2011 came early in Chicago. The snow melted by March. The tulips in Lincoln Park poked out of the ground like cautious promises. And Danielle Harper finally felt like she was waking up from a 33-year fog. She'd started volunteering at the Bridge Project, not out of obligation, but because something inside her craved the rhythm of helping. It gave her peace to file job applications, to sit with teens who had no one, to say things she wished someone had said to her. "You're not a mistake. You matter more than you know. You're not too late." And each time she spoke those words, it felt like she was stitching her own soul back together. Eddie watched her with quiet awe. "She's got your strength," he told Marlene one day, as they sat on a bench outside the center. "She's got your kindness," Marlene replied. They didn't need to say it out loud, but both of them knew. Danielle was the best of them both. One Thursday afternoon, Danielle came into the center, holding a folder. "Hey, I need you guys to look at something," she said, placing it on Eddie's desk. Inside was a proposal. She'd drafted a plan for a youth literacy and storytelling program. Not just tutoring, but life building, helping kids write their own stories, literally. "I was thinking maybe we start with 10 students, one afternoon a week," she said. "We call it," Eddie interrupted, smiling, "the Letter Project." Danielle froze, then grinned. "Yeah," she whispered, "that's perfect." That night, she called her adoptive parents in Rockford. They'd known about her search. They'd supported her quietly, though Rose had cried the night Danielle told her she'd found her birth parents. But now, Danielle wanted them to meet. "I know it's weird," she said over speakerphone, "but I think it would mean the world if you met Eddie and Marlene." Tom spoke first. "We've always wanted to meet the people who gave us the greatest gift of our lives." Danielle couldn't speak for a moment. Then Rose added softly, "You've always had more than one family. Maybe it's time we all sit at the same table." 2 weeks later, they did. The Darnells and the Harpers sat under string lights on Danielle's back porch, passing cornbread and sweet tea like old friends. Stories were told, jokes exchanged, Grace said before the meal. And when Marlene stood to thank the Harpers, her voice cracked. "You raised her right," she said. "We'll never be able to repay you." Rose took her hand. "You gave her life. We just picked up where you had to stop." And in that moment, there was no guilt, no shame, just gratitude braided between two sets of parents who had never expected to share a daughter, but now couldn't imagine life without her. Microhook, emotional tearjerker moment. Sometimes God doesn't replace what was lost. He adds something new right beside it. Not to erase the pain, but to prove that love is bigger than the years you missed. But not every chapter ends with celebration. That summer, Eddie fell ill. It started as fatigue, then came the shortness of breath. By August, the diagnosis came. Heart failure. Danielle sat beside him in the hospital, her hand in his. He smiled through the oxygen mask. "You found me just in time, baby girl." She wiped her eyes. "Don't talk like that." "I mean it," he whispered. "If you hadn't walked through that door last year..." She shook her head. "You're not going anywhere." He chuckled weakly. "Well, not yet." Then he squeezed her hand tighter. "But when I do, promise me something." She nodded. "Keep the door open for other lost kids. Like you were, like I was. I promise. Because the only thing more powerful than finding the right letter is becoming the letter someone else is waiting for." By early October, the leaves along Lakeshore Drive had turned gold and auburn, a quiet tribute to things that must fall before they rise again. Eddie's condition worsened. He refused to stay at the hospital long. "I want to go home," he told Danielle, voice faint but steady. "I want to be where I wrote your name for the first time." Marlene moved into his apartment for the final days, converting the living room into a hospice-like space, placing candles on the table and hymns on low repeat. Danielle came every day, sometimes with soup, sometimes with scripture, sometimes just with silence. They didn't need to speak much anymore. The years lost no longer demanded words. Love had filled them in. On the final night, the wind was soft through the cracked window. Marlene sat beside Eddie, holding one hand. Danielle sat on the other side, her fingers laced with his. He turned his head toward her. "Do you know why I named the center the Bridge Project?" She smiled. "You told me. To help people cross from where they are, to where they're meant to be." He shook his head faintly. "I lied." Danielle leaned in. "I named it for the bridge. I never thought I'd get to cross," he whispered. "The one that led me back to you." Her tears fell freely. "I love you, Dad." "I know," he whispered. "God gave me more than I deserved." Then he turned to Marlene, his last breath a smile. "Thank you for the letter you never sent." And just like that, he was gone. They buried him at Oakwood Cemetery on a Wednesday. The sky was heavy, but the rain held off. People came, so many people. Students, volunteers, old war buddies. Strangers who had once been hungry, angry, lost, until Eddie found them. Danielle stood at the front between her two mothers, one who raised her, one who bore her. She read from a folded paper. My father was a man who never stopped building bridges between strangers, between stories, and between hearts that forgot. They still had something left to give. She paused, then looked up. He told me once, God doesn't always answer the prayer the way we want, but he always answers. She smiled through tears. He answered mine, just in time. Invisible emotional microhook, legacy turn. That night, Danielle walked alone into the bridge project and taped a new letter to the front door. It read, to anyone who feels forgotten, come inside. Your story's not over yet. In the months that followed, the bridge project expanded. The letter program grew. Volunteers came from all over. Students began writing stories about survival, about hope, about forgiveness. Danielle ran it now, and every time she opened a new application, or held a trembling hand, or stayed late reading someone's pain between the lines, she remembered the day she walked in looking for a job form, and instead found her father. Marlene, now retired from nursing, moved closer to the center. She spent mornings cooking for the volunteers, evenings walking with Victor through nearby parks, and Sundays with both families, Harper and Darnell, seated side by side in a cozy little church on the south side. She often caught herself smiling for no reason. Because even though she had buried her youth, God had returned it to her in a woman named Danielle. She thought her silence had stolen her future. But God doesn't build futures on shame. He builds them on grace. 10 years passed. By 2021, the Bridge Project had become more than a center. It was a movement. 3 chapters across Chicago, 1 in St. Louis, another opening in Detroit, and at the heart of them all was a letter, framed, hung on every entry wall. To anyone who feels forgotten, come inside. Your story's not over yet. Danielle stood before one of those frames on a cold Tuesday evening holding a pen. In her other hand was an envelope. She'd been writing all day, drafting, redrafting, not because the words weren't right, but because they mattered so much. Now she was ready. She sealed it, wrote a name on the front, and smiled. That night she visited her father's grave. Snow covered the grass. The city lights behind her glowed faint through the trees. She sat cross-legged at the foot of the stone and placed the letter beside it. I thought you should be the first to read it, she whispered. Her voice cracked. I've been asked to give a TED Talk. She laughed softly. Crazy, right? She pulled out a copy of the letter and read it aloud. Dear Marlene, I used to think my life began the day I found you. But it didn't. It began the day you loved me, before you knew if you ever would again. I was angry for a long time, but now I see you weren't weak. You were surviving. You lost your voice once, but you found the courage to speak again. You gave me away. And then, years later, you gave me back to myself. Thank you. Love, Danielle. She left the original letter at Eddie's grave, tucked beneath a small stone. Then, she drove across town and handed the second envelope to Marlene, who opened it at the kitchen table and wept silently into her hands. Victor sat beside her, smiling gently. She wrote you a letter, he said, full circle. 2 months later, Danielle stood on a TED stage. Her talk was titled, The Letter I Never Received. She told the world her story, not with bitterness, but with reverence. She told them about Eddie, about Marlene, about forgiveness, adoption, loss, and faith, about how God doesn't forget the ones left behind. And when she finished, the audience rose, not because she was perfect, but because her story was. Marlene never sent the letter, but somehow God delivered it anyway. Because some messages are written in ink, and others are written in eternity. And so tonight, dear listener, we leave you with this. What letter in your life have you never sent? What truth have you buried too long under fear, or shame, or silence? Is it still waiting to be heard? Or are you still waiting to forgive? Because sometimes what looks like a regret is really just a redirection. And maybe, just maybe, God's already mailed it for you. Thank you for joining us tonight, for being part of our little fireside circle. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.